Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm working really hard to reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. It's a truly important milestone for me. Please click the subscribe button on the channel. It's just one click, but it gives me massive motivation to keep making more videos. Thank you all so much. Ava, she's like an old armchair. You'd replace her already, but it feels a shame to throw her out. A hush fell over the table first, brief, thick, awkward. Then someone snorted with laughter. First Dr. Lisiecki, Tomasz's colleague from the clinic, then his wife, though more out of politeness than amusement. Then the laughter spilled across the table like spilled red wine. Fast, ugly, and not entirely by accident. Ewa Majewska sat opposite her husband, her hand clenched around the stem of her wine glass. She wasn't drinking. She hadn't drunk at these dinners for years, because someone always had to keep an eye on Tomasz later, to make sure he didn't say too much, offend the wrong person, or forget where he left his coat. She was the head physician's wife, and as it turned out, that also meant being the personal technical support for his grandiosity. The restaurant in the old town of Krakow was elegant, warmly lit, full of golden reflections, white tablecloths, and people who could talk about wine as if it too held a medical degree. 8 people sat at the table: Tomasz's friends, their wives, a couple of friendly investors from the private clinic, people around whom Ava had learned over the years to smile at the right moments and fall silent when the jokes started to sting. Tomasz sat comfortably, leaning back slightly in his chair, his hand resting on the edge of the table. He was 56, salt and pepper hair, an expensive watch, and that kind of self-assurance that didn't require a raised voice. A glance was enough. People listened, patients trusted, colleagues deferred. And Ava? Ava had been the background for 29 years, a pretty, well-kept, discreet background. Tomasz, really, said Dr. Lisiecki's wife quietly, but she smiled nervously. What? Tomasz raised his eyebrows. Ava knows I'm joking, right, darling? All eyes shifted to her. 8 pairs of eyes. Curiosity, embarrassment, amusement, relief that it wasn't about them. Ewa felt the skin on her neck grow hot, but her face remained calm. Too calm. So calm it frightened her. She should answer. She should throw in something light. Something like, "And I haven't decided yet whether to give him to a museum or scrap him." Everyone would have laughed. Tomasz might even have patted her hand, delighted that his wife could keep the mood going. The dinner would have continued. Someone would have ordered dessert. Someone would have talked about a vacation in Tuscany. Someone would have asked Eva if she still made her preserves. Because surely the head physician's wife couldn't have more serious topics than pickles, jams, and Christmas decorations. But Ewa didn't answer. She just looked at Tomasz. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't look at him like a wife trying to gauge his mood. Not like a woman checking if she could speak. Not like someone who had spent years straightening the tie of a man who never noticed her own life was getting creased. She looked at him like one person to another and saw something she hadn't wanted to see before. He wasn't joking. He really thought that about her. Ewa. Tomasz waved his hand in front of her face. Zoned out? Another laugh. Shorter this time. Ewa slowly put her glass down on the table. The sound of glass hitting the surface was quiet, but to her, it sounded like the end of an era. "I heard," she said. Tomasz smiled wider. "See? Still working." This time, the laughter was forced. Even Dr. Lisiecki looked down at his plate. Ava felt something inside her not break abruptly, not explode, not tear her apart from within. It was quieter, as if someone had turned off the light in a room that had been empty for a long time anyway. For the next few minutes, people tried to return to the conversation. Someone asked about a new department at the clinic. Tomasz immediately slipped into his favorite role of the successful man. He talked about contracts, equipment, foreign patients, about how hard it was to find good staff these days. Eva sat beside his narrative, just as she had sat beside his life for almost 3 decades. She heard the words, but they no longer reached her. She saw his profile, the same one she had once kissed on the ear in a small rented apartment when they were young, poor, and convinced the whole world lay before them. She remembered Tomasz studying for exams at the kitchen table, and she making him tea and copying his notes because his handwriting was terrible. She remembered after Natalia was born, not sleeping for nights, and still ironing his shirt in the morning because he had important consultations. She remembered the moves, the loans, the shifts, the holidays spent half alone because the clinic always came first, and for years she told herself that this was what marriage was like, that love simply changed color, that a mature woman shouldn't expect fireworks, that respect could be silent. But that evening, she understood something terrible. Silence isn't always respect. Sometimes it's just the space where the other person slowly buries you, spoon by spoon, so you don't even notice when you stop breathing. "Iwa, what are you doing now?" one of the women, Mrs. Dorota, the investor's wife, asked suddenly. The question hung over the table. Eva opened her mouth, but Tomasz was faster. "What she always does," he said lightly. "Ensuring I don't go hungry, and my shirts are clean. That's an important social function too." Someone smiled again. This time Eva did too, but it wasn't the smile of someone accepting a joke. It was the smile of a woman who had just closed a door behind her, even though no one had heard the click yet. "Yes," she said calmly. "Very important, especially when a man hasn't learned to operate a washing machine for years." A silence fell over the table. Tomasz slowly turned his head. "I beg your pardon?" "I said," Eva continued, "that a washing machine has fewer functions than an MRI, so maybe one day you'll manage." Dr. Lisetsky coughed into his napkin. His wife lowered her head, but Eva was almost certain she was smiling. Tomasz didn't like it when someone stole his spotlight, especially not her. "I see, we're having an evening of malice," he said coldly. "No," Eva replied. "We're having an evening of honesty. You started it." She didn't raise her voice, didn't throw a napkin, didn't storm out of the restaurant theatrically, didn't do anything that could later be described as hysteria. She simply pushed her chair back. "Excuse me, everyone," she said, looking at the faces around the table in turn. "Thank you for the dinner," Tomasz hissed quietly. "Eva, sit down." That one word, sit, hit her harder than the earlier joke, because it didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a command issued to a dog that had lingered too long at the table. Eva put on her coat, beige, elegant, the same one Tomasz had once called boring but appropriate. She picked up her purse from the back of her chair and looked at him one last time that evening. "I'm not your armchair, Tomasz." The restaurant fell so silent that the clinking of cutlery could be heard from the far end of the room. "And you don't need to throw me out," she added. "I'll get up myself." She turned and walked towards the exit. Behind her, Tomasz said something, but she didn't catch the words. Perhaps he was trying to stop her. Perhaps he was explaining to the guests that women of a certain age had their moods. Perhaps he was doing what he always did, turning someone else's pain into an anecdote to make himself look better. Outside, the air was cold. Krakow glistened with wet cobblestones, as if the street had just been washed clean of the whole day. Eva stood under the restaurant, and for a moment didn't know where to go. She was 52 years old, 29 years married, with a daughter who called her father more often than her. A home she had decorated for half her life, though she felt less and less at home in it. And a husband who, in front of everyone, had just told her who she really was to him. An old armchair. Eva laughed suddenly, a short, bitter laugh, almost soundless, because for so many years she had been afraid that if she left, she would have nothing, And now she felt something strange. She didn't have a plan yet, didn't have the courage for tomorrow, didn't even have the certainty that she wouldn't cry in a taxi like a child in an hour. But she had one thing. For the first time in many years, she had herself. She took out her phone. On the screen, she saw 3 missed calls from Tomasz, though only 2 minutes had passed. She didn't call back. Instead, she opened the taxi app and entered the address of her aunt's old apartment in Podgórze, the one that had been empty for months because Tomasz claimed it wasn't worth bothering with. When the car arrived, Ewa sat in the back and looked through the window at the restaurant. In the window, she saw Tomasz. He stood by the table, gesturing, explaining something to the guests. Even from a distance, he looked indignant, like a man who had been served the wrong wine by a waiter, not like a husband who had just lost his wife. Ewa rested her head against the headrest. "Where are we going?" the driver asked. For a moment, she was silent. Then she replied, "Home." And for the first time in a long time, those words didn't mean the place where Tomasz was waiting. The taxi stopped in front of an old tenement building in Podgórze, a little after 11 p.m. Ewa sat motionless for a moment, looking at the dark windows of the building. The tenement was tall, slightly shabby, with a gate as heavy as if it remembered more human dramas than many a family court. A small grocery store operated on the ground floor, already closed at this hour, and next to the entrance, a broken lantern flickered. The light went out, and on every few seconds, as if it couldn't decide whether it was still worth shining for anyone. The driver asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Ewa blinked. "Yes," she replied quickly. "Yes, thank you." She paid, got out, and stood on the sidewalk, her purse pressed to her chest. The cold air hit her face, but there was nothing unpleasant about it. On the contrary, after the stuffy restaurant, after the laughter of Tomasz's friends, after his look of offended pride, this chill seemed honest. It didn't pretend to be warm, didn't pat her on the shoulder, didn't say, "You're overreacting." Aunt Helena's apartment was on the 2nd floor. Ewa had inherited it a year earlier, but Tomasz had treated it as a problem to be solved from the start. "We'll sell it," he had said without hesitation. "What do we need an old hovel for? We'll add to the deposit, or buy a parking space at the clinic." "We!" How easily he had said "we" over the years when the decision was his. Ewa hadn't protested then. She had only replied that maybe they would wait, that it was the only thing left of her aunt. Tomasz had sighed, as if hearing the argument of a child who wanted to keep a broken toy because of sentiment. Now she slid the key into the lock and turned it with difficulty. The door opened with a groan. Inside, it smelled of dust, old wood, and closed air. The hallway was narrow, with faded yellow wallpaper and a mirror in a dark frame. Aunt Helena's hat still hung on the coat rack, as if the old woman had just gone out for bread and would be back any moment, complaining about the price of butter. Ewa turned on the light. The bulb flickered once, twice, then glowed with a pale light. The apartment was small, 2 rooms, a kitchen, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Everything needed renovation. The paint peeled at the frames, the floorboards creaked, and the radiators looked like they had last heated with enthusiasm in the days when telephones had cords. But this place had one enormous advantage. Tomasz wasn't here. Ewa took off her coat and hung it carefully on a chair. She didn't have pajamas, didn't have a toothbrush, didn't have any belongings, besides her phone, documents, and the lipstick she always carried in her purse out of habit. Though for a long time, she had only put on lipstick when Tomasz said, "Let's look decent today." She sat on the sofa, covered with an old blanket. The springs groaned under her like a tired person. The phone vibrated. "Tomasz." She didn't answer. A moment later, another message. Stop making a scene. Come home. Ava looked at the screen for a very long time. Home. Just a few hours ago, she would have obeyed that command. Maybe not immediately, maybe after tears, maybe after a short walk, but she would have returned. She would have apologized for her reaction. He would have accepted the apology with the air of someone granting forgiveness. Then he would have been cool for 2 days, pretended nothing happened on the 3rd, and on the 4th, he would have asked her to pick up his suit from the dry cleaners. Their marriage was like that. There wasn't one grand disaster. It was 1,000 tiny concessions, so minuscule that each one, on its own, seemed trivial. Until one day, Iwa realized these concessions had built a cage. The phone vibrated again. Iwa, don't embarrass me. This time, she let out a quiet snort. I'm not worried. No, where are you? I'm not apologizing. Just don't embarrass me. In that single sentence lay their entire life, condensed like a diagnosis from a doctor who hadn't even looked his patient in the eye. Ewa placed the phone face down. She stood up and slowly walked around the apartment. In the bedroom stood an old metal-framed bed. In the wardrobe hung a few of her aunt's dresses, smelling of lavender and thyme. In the kitchen, she found tea, probably older than some of Tomasz's acquaintances, and sugar in a porcelain sugar bowl. She put water on to boil in the kettle, which gurgled as if to say, "Well, darling, it'll be tough, but at least there'll be hot tea." When she returned to the living room with a mug in her hand, the phone lit up again. This time, it was Natalia calling. Eva's heart squeezed painfully. She picked up, "Mom." Her daughter's voice was strained. "What happened?" Dad called. "He said you left dinner and made a scene." Ewa closed her eyes. Of course. Tomasz always told his story first. He knew that whoever labeled the facts first, for a moment, looked like the owner of the truth. "I didn't make a scene," she said. "I left quietly." "But why?" "Dad says you misunderstood a joke." Ewa glanced at her reflection in the dark window. A pale face, tired eyes, hair slightly disheveled by the wind. A woman who looked like she'd survived a war, though she had only just emerged from it. He said, in front of people, that I'm like an old armchair he'd replace, but it's a shame to throw away. Silence fell on the other end. "Dad said that?" Natalia asked, quieter. "Yes. Maybe he was really joking." Ewa felt a pang, not because her daughter had hurt her, but more because she heard in her daughter's voice an echo of herself from years ago. Maybe he was joking. Maybe he had a bad day. Maybe he didn't mean it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe if I were nicer, younger, quieter, more understanding, less tired, more elegant, less myself, maybe then I wouldn't have to be hurt. "Natalia," she said gently, "a joke is when both sides laugh." Her daughter sighed. "Mom, but you can't just leave after so many years. You're married. People say all sorts of things." "I know. For 29 years, I've heard a lot of different things. And what now? Are you going to sleep at my place?" "No. I'm at Aunt Helena's apartment." "In that ruin?" Natalia blurted out. Eva smiled sadly. "In that ruin. It's calmer today than in our house." "Mom, you don't have to understand anything right now, really. But please, don't just repeat Dad's version before you hear mine." Natalia was silent for a long time. "I'll call tomorrow," she finally said. "'Kay? And take care of yourself." It was a small sentence, not an apology, not a reprieve, not a breakthrough, but Ewa accepted it, like a blanket, offered to someone standing in the cold. "I'll take care," she replied. After the call, the apartment grew even quieter. Ewa finished her tea, though it tasted of dust, linden, and something hard to classify as food. Then she lay down on the sofa in her clothes, covering her feet with an old blanket. For a long time, She stared at the ceiling, not crying. Tears came only towards morning, silently, without dramatic sobs. They trickled down her temples and soaked into the pillow, as if her body were making up for what her soul lacked the strength to express in front of witnesses. She was awakened by banging on the door. Ewa sat up abruptly. It was gray outside the window. The city was just stretching after the night. The knocking repeated. Loud, impatient, familiar. Ewa, open, Tomasz. For a moment, she sat motionless. Her heart pounded, but something had changed. Yesterday, she had still feared his anger. Today, she feared more that she might yield again. She stood up, straightened her blouse, and walked to the door. She didn't open it immediately. "Why did you come?" she asked through the closed door. "Don't be silly. We need to talk. You want to talk now? Aoife, open this door." His voice had that tone that for years had been enough to make her step back. This time, she didn't. She turned the lock but left the chain on. The door opened a few inches. Tomasz stood in the hallway in yesterday's coat, his face that of a man who had slept poorly and endured loss of control even worse. In his hand, he held her small suitcase. "I packed a few things for you," he said, "since you decided to put on a melodrama." Ewa looked at the suitcase, then at him. "Thank you." That one word clearly threw him off. "Ewa, stop it. You're coming home. We'll talk normally." He frowned. "What? No, I'm not coming back." For a second, he looked as if he didn't understand Polish. The chief physician, an authority, a man for difficult diagnoses, defeated by the simplest word in the world. "You can't just leave." "I can." After one joke, Ewa felt the calm within her harden. Not after one joke, after years of being a joke. Tomasz clenched his jaw. "You're exaggerating?" "I know you think so. That's why I'm here." Silence fell in the hallway. Somewhere below, a door slammed. Someone was going downstairs with a dog that apparently had more tact than most of Tomasz's acquaintances, because it wasn't barking. Her husband leaned in slightly. "Ewa, listen. Let's go home. You'll calm down. People have worse problems. Perhaps, but these are my problems, and for the first time in years, I intend to take them seriously." Tomasz looked at her for a long time. Then his face hardened. "Is there someone else?" Ewa couldn't help but laugh. A short, disbelieving laugh. "Really? Is that the only explanation that comes to your mind? That if a woman leaves, she must have another man? What am I supposed to think? That maybe she's finally had enough of this one?" The sentence hung between them, like a knife stuck in a wooden door. Tomasz took a step back. For the first time, he didn't have a ready answer. Aoife removed the chain, opened the door wider, and reached for the suitcase. "Leave it, Aoife. Leave the suitcase, Tomasz." For a moment, it looked like he wanted to refuse, if only so that something still depended on him. In the end, however, he placed the suitcase on the threshold. Aoife pulled it inside. "I'll call a lawyer," she said. Tomasz raised his head. "What? A lawyer? For a divorce?" Something between anger and disbelief appeared on his face. "Don't be ridiculous." Ewa looked at him calmly. "It's enough that you've been doing that for me." And she closed the door. She didn't slam it. She didn't have to. The quiet click of the lock sounded much louder. "I am not your property, Tomasz. And this time, I'm really not coming back." Ewa said this to the empty room. She stood barefoot on the cold floor of Aunt Helena's apartment, her phone in her hand, her heart pounding, as if she had just run half of Krakow. She had just ended a conversation with her husband, or rather, not a conversation, but another attempt at an interrogation. Tomasz hadn't asked how she felt. He hadn't asked if she'd slept. He hadn't asked if she'd eaten. He asked when she would stop playing the victim. For years, Ewa had heard authority in his voice. Now, she increasingly heard only the irritation of a man whose convenient household appliance had broken down. First the washing machine, then the wife. The difference is that a washing machine is at least serviced sometimes. She placed the phone on the windowsill and looked out the window. The courtyard between the tenement houses was gray, wet, and somewhat depressing. A carpet hung on the clothesline, looking like it had lived through more than one family. Somewhere below, an old man was feeding pigeons, and they lunged for the crumbs with the determination of those fighting for an inheritance from a rich aunt. Eva gave a pale smile. It was morning, the third day after dinner, the third day of her new life. Although, for now, her new life resembled an old room with a non-functional lamp, a single mug, and a refrigerator inhabited solely by mustard, light, and the question, what next? Tomasz's suitcase stood in the hallway. He had packed a few things for her, but he managed to humiliate her, even in that. Inside, she found 2 blouses she didn't like, an old sweater, a cosmetic bag without cream, her favorite dress rolled up carelessly, and slippers. Slippers, as if he wanted to say, "Here, sit in the corner and wait until you come to your senses." But what hurt her the most was something else. He hadn't packed any of her books, nor the album with Natalia's childhood photos, nor the sketchbook she used to keep on her nightstand. He probably didn't even know it was there. Ewa walked into the small kitchen and made coffee. It was too strong, bitter, and a little burnt, but she drank it at the table, covered with a blue floral oilcloth. Aunt Helena always said that oilcloth was a brilliant invention, because a person could spill their whole life on it, and it was enough to wipe it with a cloth. That's what Eva needed, something that could be wiped away. Around 11 o'clock, the intercom rang. She froze. For a second, she thought it was Tomasz, that he would come again with the face of an offended king whose peasants hadn't paid their tribute. But from the speaker came the voice of the courier. A package for Miss Iwa Majewska. What package? From the clinic. Documents, I think. Iwa let him in reflexively. A few minutes later, she held a large envelope in her hands. The logo of Tomasz's private clinic was on the corner. For a moment, she felt like putting it down, not opening it, pretending nothing had arrived. But that stage was over. She had lived too many years with her eyes closed. She tore open the envelope. Inside were documents related to health insurance and powers of attorney that she had once signed automatically, because Tomasz had said, "It's just a formality. Trust me." Eva flipped through the pages without much understanding, until a small sticky note, pink with handwritten script, slipped out from between them. "Tomek, you left this with me. Yesterday was wonderful. K." Eva stared at these words for a very long time. At first, she felt nothing, absolutely nothing, as if someone had shown her the weather in a foreign city. Only after a moment did the meaning begin to return to her slowly, layer by layer. "With me yesterday was wonderful. Claudia, the young nurse from the clinic, the same one Tomasz spoke of, with exaggerated indifference. An ambitious girl, but she still had a lot to learn. Eva had seen her twice. Blonde hair, perfect makeup, a white coat, and a look that became overly polite when she looked at Eva. The look of a woman who already knew someone's home, even though she had never been officially invited. Eva sat down. The note trembled in her hand. So it wasn't just a joke, not just fatigue, not just a midlife crisis that Tomasz nurtured like an exotic plant in a pot. It was something more. For the past few months, Eva had felt her husband drifting away from her, even more than usual. Longer shifts, more meetings, the phone turned face down, new perfume. Though for years he had used the same one, and claimed that a man only changes his scent when he doesn't know who he is. Now she knew. He wasn't changing his scent, he was changing his life. He just forgot to tell her about it. Ewa stood up so abruptly that the chair squeaked. She grabbed her coat, the documents, and her keys. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she knew she couldn't sit in that apartment with the pink note that was laughing at her in thin, feminine handwriting. It was cold on the street. She walked straight ahead towards Kazimierz. Krakow that day was damp, nervous, full of cars and people, rushing as if everyone knew their destination. Ewa envied them their certainty for a moment. She only had a direction. Sometimes that's enough not to turn back. She passed a cafe, a bookstore, a frame shop, and a small gallery on a side street. She stopped only when she saw a familiar face through the window. Irena, an old friend from art school. Ewa hadn't seen her in almost 10 years. Their contact had faded slowly, without a fight, like many things in Ewa's life. First, lack of time. Then birthdays she missed, because Tomasz had a banquet. Then calls she didn't return. Then the shame that so many years had passed. Irena stood in the gallery, talking to a client. She had short silver hair, a colorful scarf, and the same energetic hand movements, as if the world were a canvas and she were constantly adjusting its composition. Evia wanted to leave. She'd already taken a step back. Then Irena glanced towards the window. Their eyes met. A flicker of surprise, then recognition, crossed Irena's face, followed by something warm that Evia hadn't felt in a long time. Joy. Irena rushed out of the gallery without her coat. Ewa, my dear mother. Ewa Majewska. Ewa offered a hesitant smile. Hi, Irenka. Hi. Irena grabbed her by the shoulders. Woman, you vanished from my life like a good cake from the office kitchen. It was there. You turned around, and it was gone. Eva let out a snort of laughter, the first genuine one in days, and the laughter almost broke her, because tears followed immediately. Irena noticed it at once. Her face grew serious. Come inside. I don't want to intrude. Intrude? That's like a neighbor with a drill on a Sunday. You're coming in. The gallery smelled of paint, wood, and coffee. The walls were adorned with works by young artists, portraits, landscapes, abstracts. Ewa felt a strange pang in her heart, as if she had entered a room where she had left a part of herself long ago, and that part had patiently waited on a chair all this time. Irena sat her down in the back room and placed a mug of tea in front of her. Speak. Ewa was silent for a moment, then recounted the dinner, the joke, the aunt's apartment, Natalia, Tomasz standing by the door with a suitcase, and finally, the pink note. When she finished, Irena offered no cheap platitudes. She didn't say, everything will be all right, because smart women know that sometimes it's bad for a long time first. Instead, she asked, and you, where are you in all of this? Ewa looked at her helplessly. I don't know. Then start looking. How? Irena leaned against the counter, narrowed her eyes, and smiled faintly. You used to paint. I remember your sketches. You had a knack for faces. You could draw sadness so well that people felt like making it a cup of tea. Ewa shook her head. That was a long time ago. Well, dust is old too, and yet it comes back every day. I don't have any paints. You have me. Irena stood up, walked to a shelf, and took out a small watercolor set, some brushes, and a thick sketchbook. She placed them in front of Ewa. I can't. You can. It's not open-heart surgery. It's paper. Ewa ran her fingers over the sketchbook's cover. Something tightened in her throat. I'm afraid I'm not good at anything anymore. Irena looked at her gently. Ewa, for 30 years you managed to pretend you weren't hurting. Painting will be a vacation compared to that. That evening, Ewa returned to her aunt's apartment with a bag full of paints and a head full of silence. Not the bad, humiliating silence from the restaurant, but a different kind. One where something could begin to grow. She placed the sketchbook on the kitchen table. For a long time, She stared at the blank page. Then she picked up a pencil. Her hand trembled slightly. She drew a closed door, and in front of it, a woman standing with her back to the viewer. The woman didn't yet have a face, an age or a name, but she had an erect posture. Eva looked at it for a long time, and then, for the first time in years, she signed the drawing not as Tomasz Majewski's wife, but with a single word, Eva. Mom, Dad says you want to destroy him. Is that true? Eva stood by the kitchen table, paintbrush in hand, when she heard Natalia's voice on the phone. She froze for a moment. A drop of dark blue paint fell onto a newspaper, spread beneath the sketchbook, and slowly spread, forming a shape like a small storm cloud. For a few seconds, Eva didn't answer. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew all too well. No, Natalia, she replied finally, calmly. I don't want to destroy him. I just want to stop being destroyed. Silence fell on the other end. The same silence Eva knew from her own youth. The silence of someone hearing something important, but not yet able to accept it. Dad says you're exaggerating. Natalia's voice came through, saying you've always been sensitive, that you've suddenly convinced yourself you've been wronged. Eva put the brush down in the mug of water. The blue bled through her like dark streaks. Your father always liked telling people how they felt, she said quietly. It's convenient. Then you don't have to listen. Natalia sighed. Mom, I don't want to choose between you, and I'm not asking you to, but I feel like you've already chosen for me. You moved out. You're talking about divorce. Dad's furious, and I'm stuck in the middle like an idiot. Eva felt a pang in her heart. Natalia was 26. She had her own job, her own apartment, and the same stubbornness in her voice that Eva once had in her eyes, before she silenced it. You're not an idiot, she said. You're the daughter of people who've forgotten how to live together. It's a difficult place to be. Then why aren't you trying to fix it? Eva looked at the drawing lying in front of her. The woman standing by the door now had a tired but bright face. Not young, but alive. Eva hadn't planned to draw it this way. Her hand simply knew more than her head. Because for many years, I was fixing things that Tomasz kept breaking, she replied. And you know what the worst part is? That in the end, I didn't even notice that I was the one cleaning up after his every contemptuous act. Natalia said nothing. Come visit me, Eva asked. Not today as a judge, not as your father's lawyer, just as my daughter. I don't know if I can, Natalia whispered. Then come as someone who wants to learn. They hung up without any promises. Eva stared at the phone for a long time. She didn't know if Natalia would come. She didn't know if their conversation had changed anything. For years, her father had been larger than life to her daughter. A doctor, an authority figure, a successful man, a man who told jokes at the table and paid bills without looking at the amount. And Eva? Eva was the one who remembered birthdays, medications, dinners, bills, gifts for teachers, clothes for school plays, and bandages for scraped knees. She was everywhere, so she became invisible, like air. People only appreciate it when they start to suffocate. 2 days later, Natalia appeared at Irena's gallery. Eva was helping arrange catalogs on a small table by the entrance. She wore a simple cream blouse, dark trousers, and her hair was tied back more loosely than usual. Irena had insisted she add a colorful scarf. You look like a woman who can still insult someone intelligently, she declared with satisfaction that morning. Eva considered it a compliment. At her age, one accepts praise wherever it comes from, as long as there's no receipt. When she saw Natalia in the gallery doorway, she felt her hands suddenly grow clammy with stress. Her daughter stood uncertainly, in an elegant coat and with a handbag slung over her shoulder. She had Tomas's features, but her eyes were Eva's. Only now those eyes were cautious. Hi, Natalia said. Hi, darling. They didn't embrace. There was no cinematic music, no applause from onlookers in the background. Life rarely has such a good production department. But there was a small step towards the inside, and that was enough. Do you work here? She asked, looking around the gallery. I'm helping Irena. A few hours a day for now. Dad says it's a temporary whim. Tiwa smiled sadly. Your father would call a fire a whim if he wasn't the one holding the matches. Natalia looked at her, surprised. Ewa didn't used to talk about Tomasz like that. She used to soften things, explain them away. She would change the subject, like someone covering a crack in the wall with their hand, even though the whole house was creaking. I'm sorry, Natalia said. I shouldn't have repeated what he said immediately. Repeating isn't the worst, Ewa replied. The worst is when people stop asking if it's true. Natalia walked over to one of the walls. Young painters' works hung there, but on a side table lay Eva's sketches, which Irena had framed in simple passepartouts without asking. Are these yours? The daughter asked. Ewa felt a blush rise. Yes, just attempts. Natalia picked up a sketch. It depicted a woman sitting at a table with a cup of coffee. Behind her, a large man's shadow could be seen, but the woman herself was looking towards a window where dawn was breaking. Is that you? Natalia asked. I suppose so. Why isn't she looking at that man? Eva moved closer, having stared long enough. Natalia bit her lip. For a moment, she looked as if she wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if she had the right. Just then, Tomasz entered the gallery. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared in the doorway, in his expensive coat, with his perfectly tied scarf, and the expression of someone who had accidentally wandered into a place beneath his social standing. So this is where you are, he said. Ewa slowly turned her head. As you can see, Natalia stiffened. Dad, what are you doing here? I wanted to talk to your mother, since she's been acting like a teenager, after her first argument for the past few days. Irena, who was standing behind the counter, raised an eyebrow. Good morning to you too, sir. We usually say good morning first, and then insult the gallery owner and her guests. But I understand that in private clinics, the order might be different. Ewa almost smiled. Tomasz ignored Irena. Ewa, are you really planning to make an artist of yourself? Natalia looked at her father. Dad, stop. But he was already in his familiar rhythm, where every word was elegantly phrased, yet carried contempt within. Natalia, don't interfere. Your mother is having a crisis. She'll get over it soon. Come home, and we'll all pretend this embarrassing episode with the paints never happened. Ewa felt something tighten within her. But before she could respond, Natalia spoke. And what if she doesn't want to come back? Tomasz looked at his daughter as if she had just said something exceptionally foolish. Of course she'll come back. How do you know that? Can't she manage on her own? Those words fell into the gallery like a stone dropped into a well. Ewa paled but didn't look away. Natalia, on the other hand, looked at her father with widening eyes, as if, for the first time, in this small gallery in Kazimierz, she heard not just a sentence, but the entire melody of their marriage. That tone, that assumption, that certainty that Ewa was nothing without him. Do you really think so? She asked quietly. Tomasz frowned. I think realistically. No, Natalia said. You think cruelly. Tomasz's face hardened. Watch how you speak to me, and you watch how you speak about your mother. Ewa held her breath. This wasn't a major breakthrough yet. Not the finale, not full understanding. But it was the first time Natalia hadn't stood between them as her father's interpreter. She stood beside her mother. Tomasz looked at both women. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, like surprise, perhaps even fear. Not of them, but of the fact that the scene he had always controlled had suddenly changed actresses set, and director. I see you're all having a wonderful time here, he said icily. Independent family theater. Irena leaned over the counter. More of a social drama, but your role is becoming increasingly less sympathetic. Tomasz shot her a brief glance, then turned and left. The gallery door closed behind him with a faint chime. Natalia stood motionless. Ava slowly approached her. Darling, did he always talk to you like that? The daughter asked. Ava didn't answer immediately, because the truth was difficult. Not always the same way. Sometimes more quietly, sometimes in front of people. Sometimes between one sip of coffee and the next. Sometimes in a joking tone. Sometimes in silence. More often than I'd like to admit, she finally said. Natalia covered her mouth with her hand. Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't see it, because I was very careful that you wouldn't see it. That sentence broke something in both of them. Natalia walked over to her mother and hugged her cautiously, as if afraid Awa would crumble from too strong a touch. But Awa didn't crumble. She stood tall with her daughter at her shoulder. The gallery smelled of coffee, wood, and paint. Outside, Krakow continued its rhythm, indifferent to small family revolutions. Yet for Eva, the world had shifted a few centimeters in the right direction that day. Natalia pulled away after a moment and looked at the sketch of the woman by the window. Mom, she said quietly, can I buy this drawing? Iwa blinked. Buy it? I can give it to you. Natalia shook her head. I don't want to pay for it, because if it's your work, I don't want to take it as something I'm owed. Iwa felt tears welling up in her eyes, not because her daughter wanted to buy a sketch, but because, for the first time in a long while, someone close to her had seen her not as a function, not as the mother who took phone calls, not as the surgeon's wife, not as the woman responsible for laundry, dinner, and family peace treaties, but as a human being who had created something. Good, she whispered. Natalia smiled through her tears. Just don't give me a family discount. Irena, from the back room, immediately called out, Our family discount means you pay full price and then bring us cake. This time, all three of them laughed, and Iwa, hearing their laughter, understood that home sometimes doesn't start with walls. Sometimes it starts with the first person who truly stands by your side. You don't need to prove you're strong. It's enough that you're no longer pretending to be weak. Eva turned around sharply. A man stood a few steps away, by a ladder, a hammer in one hand and a spirit level in the other. He was in his early 50s, graying at the temples, with the face of a man who didn't rush to judgment. He wore a dark sweater, a work jacket, and glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He didn't look like someone from Tomasz's elegant world. He didn't wear a watch worth a nurse's monthly salary. He didn't speak with theatrical confidence, nor did he try to fill the entire room with his presence. Yet, Eva felt strangely seen by him. Yes, she asked cautiously. Excuse me, he smiled faintly. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. You were just talking to the painting so loudly that even the wall seemed embarrassed. Eva glanced at the canvas, leaning against the gallery window. Indeed, for the past few minutes, she'd been muttering to it, trying to decide if the dark smudge in the corner was a shadow or a catastrophic painting mistake. It wasn't a monologue, she said. It was a negotiation with the painting, with my own uncertainty. The man nodded gravely. A difficult opponent. They usually know all our weak points. Irena entered the gallery with a mug of coffee and an expression that suggested she'd just caught life red-handed. I see you've met, she announced. Iwo, this is Adam Rubel, a conservator, an architect with a past, and a man who can hang a picture straight, which in these times is almost a romantic trait. Adam, this is Iwa Majewska. She paints, she breathes after years, and she pretends she doesn't need friends. Irena, Ewa admonished her, but without anger. What? I didn't say you were as stubborn as a cork in old wine. You just did, but with feeling. Adam chuckled softly. It wasn't a laugh at Ewa's expense. It was the laugh of someone who understood that people sometimes hide pain behind a joke, so it doesn't spill onto the floor. In the following days, Adam visited the gallery more and more often. Irena had asked him to help prepare for a small exhibition of local artists. But Ewa quickly noticed that he always found a moment to ask about her paintings. Not intrusively, not with that male expert tone that could discuss a woman's suffering as if delivering a lecture. He asked simply, "Why is this woman facing away? What's behind that door? Does this light signify hope, or just that someone forgot to turn off the lamp?" At the last question, Ewa snorted with laughter. "You don't take art seriously enough. On the contrary, I take it so seriously that I don't pretend to understand everything." That sentence stayed with her for a long time. Tomasz had always needed to understand everything. He even explained her feelings better than she could. When she was sad, he'd say she was being dramatic. When she was silent, he'd say she was sulking. When she tried to speak, he'd say she was choosing the wrong moment. With Adam, silence wasn't a punishment. It was a space where one could calmly place a mug of coffee. One afternoon, as rain streamed down the gallery windows, Adam helped her move a larger canvas to the back. The painting depicted a woman standing on a balcony. Her face was unseen, but her arms were outstretched, as if after a long time, she was finally breathing in. "This one is different," Adam said. "Better, freer." Ewa looked at him. "Freer? Yes. The others looked like someone trying to escape. This woman isn't escaping. She's already left." Ewa felt her throat tighten with emotion. She looked away, pretending to adjust the frame. "You see too much. Perhaps. In my profession, it's a risk. Old buildings don't tell you directly where they're cracking. You have to look closely. People don't tell you either." Adam was silent for a moment. "I know." In that brief, "I know," was more than mere politeness. Aoife later learned that Adam was divorced. His wife had left him after 30 years, leaving him a house full of books, an empty armchair by the window, and a dog who, for the first few months, looked at the door with more faith than he did. Alone, he didn't talk about it with bitterness, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who had stopped fighting what could no longer be changed. "And you didn't hate her?" Eva asked one evening, as they were closing the gallery. Adam turned the key in the lock. "I tried, but hate is exhausting. You have to feed it daily. And at some point, I barely remembered to water my fern." Ewa smiled involuntarily. "And what did you do?" "I gave the fern to a neighbor, and the hate to itself." They walked back together through Kazimierz. They didn't hold hands. No grand words were spoken. Adam simply walked her to the tram stop and waited until she got on. It was nothing, really. Yet, sitting by the window, Ewa felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not infatuation, not that violent storm that youth sometimes mistakes for destiny. She felt peace. A few days later, Natalia came to the gallery with cake. True to Irena's joke, she figured that since she'd bought her mother's drawing, she had to pay with a cheesecake too. Irena accepted the baked good with the solemnity of a notary. "Transaction successfully completed," she declared. Natalia spoke with Eva more often. Still cautiously, still with a sense of guilt, but no longer with that blind defense of her father. One evening she said, "Dad called. He asked if you and that Adam, you know." Eva raised her eyebrows. "If I what? If you were having an affair?" Eva chuckled softly. "Of course. The man handed me a hammer and asked about a painting. So according to your father, we're probably planning our escape to Greece." Natalia smiled, Then her expression turned serious. He's jealous. No, he's angry that something in my life is happening without his permission. That same evening, Eva returned to her apartment after visiting her aunt and stood before the mirror in the hallway. The woman looking back at her still had wrinkles, fatigue under her eyes, and hair that didn't always cooperate with human civilization, but there was a new softness about her. Not weakness, but the softness of a person who had stopped fighting her own reflection. Her phone vibrated. A message from Adam. I'm hanging frames in the gallery tomorrow. If you're negotiating with paintings, I can mediate. Eva read the message twice, then replied, Please be careful. My paintings are stubborn. The reply came a moment later. That's good. The most interesting things are rarely obedient. Eva put down her phone and looked at her latest painting. The woman on the balcony was almost finished. Behind her, there were no closed doors. In front of her, no man casting a shadow. There was dawn, and a city just waking up. Do you really think you mean anything without my name? Tomasz uttered the words quietly, but in the law office, they echoed like a hand slamming on a table. Eva sat opposite him, on the other side of a long, bright desk. Between them lay divorce papers, a property settlement, and a pen that, for the last few minutes, felt heavier than all the years of their marriage. Beside Eva sat her lawyer, a calm woman in a navy blazer. On the other side sat Tomasz's counsel, a man with a face so impassive it seemed he'd practiced it in front of a mirror for cases where no one emerged happy. Tomasz looked elegant, as always. Expensive shoes, a perfectly ironed shirt, a coat draped over the back of his chair, a man of success, a surgeon, an authority, a man who for years could make others feel smaller, even without raising his voice. Eva looked at him calmly. A few months ago, those words would have shattered her from the inside. She would have gone home, locked herself in the bathroom, and cried quietly so he wouldn't hear. Then she would have touched up her makeup, gone to the kitchen, and asked if he wanted tea. But that woman was no longer there. She hadn't died. She had simply stopped being useful for others' convenience. Tomasz, she said slowly. Your name opened many doors for years, but every time I walked through them, I had to leave a piece of myself behind. Tomasz scoffed. A beautiful sentence. Did Irena write it for you? No, Eva replied. Life. Ewa's lawyer gently slid a document towards her. Miss Ewa, if everything is clear, we can sign. Ewa took the pen. For a moment, she looked at her name printed on the white paper. Ewa Majewska. For almost 30 years, this surname had been both her home and her cage. She had grown accustomed to it, much like a person grows accustomed to shoes that pinch, but are still wearable. Now, for the first time, she felt that the surname didn't define who she was. She signed. One stroke of the hand, a black line on paper, the end of a marriage that had ended long before the documents. Tomasz also signed, though with the expression of a man who wasn't losing, but merely allowing the world to be mistaken for a while. When they left the law office, the corridor was empty. A light rain was falling outside. The same Krakow, the same old buildings, the same hum of the street. Yet, Eva felt as if everything was different. Tomasz stopped by the elevator. Eva turned. Yes? For a moment, he was silent. He looked at her intently, as if trying to find his former wife in her face, the one who waited for his gesture, his approval, his moods. But he found only a woman, in a light coat, with her back straight and eyes calmer than ever. Is this really the end? He asked. There was no romantic contrition in his voice, but rather the disbelief of a man who, his whole life, had assumed certain things would always remain in place, like an armchair. Eva smiled slightly. No, Tomasz, For me, this is a beginning. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Tomasz stepped inside, but Eva remained in the corridor. Not because she wanted to create a theatrical scene, but simply because she no longer had the desire to travel in the same direction as him. A few hours later, warm lights glowed in Irena's gallery. Eva's paintings hung on the walls. Her first small solo exhibition. There was no red carpet, no cameras, no critics speaking in words so complicated that even the paintings might have felt embarrassed. There were people, neighbors from Podgorze, Irena's friends, a few gallery patrons, Natalia, Adam. Irena circulated among the guests with a tray of glasses and the expression of a general commanding a battle for a good impression. "Smile," she whispered to Eva. "An artist at her first exhibition should look mysterious, but not like she's lost her ID." Irena chuckled softly. Natalia approached her a moment later. She held an exhibition catalog. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Eva looked at her daughter. The words were simple, but they went deep, to a place that for years had heard mostly. "Don't exaggerate. Calm down. Not now. Thank you, darling." Natalia hugged her tightly, this time without caution. Adam stood by the largest painting. It depicted a woman on a balcony at dawn. The wind ruffled her hair, and the city below her slowly awoke. There was no cry in this painting. There was silence, but not the silence of a restaurant, not the silence of humiliation, but the silence of choice. Eva walked over to Adam. "And what do you see?" she asked. Adam looked at the painting, then at her. Someone who didn't return to the cage, even though she left a lot behind in it for years. Eva lowered her gaze, smiling. "It sounds sad." "No," he said gently. "It sounds true." The evening passed peacefully. People talked, admired the paintings, asked questions. Someone bought a small watercolor of a woman standing before an open door. Irena nearly had an artistic heart attack over it, but she composed herself with the dignity of a salesperson who smells commission in the air. At the exhibition's close, Ewa found herself alone by the window. Beyond the glass, Krakow shimmered, washed clean by the rain. Once, she'd feared solitude, picturing it as an empty apartment, a single cup in the sink, and a silence so profound you could hear your own thoughts echo. Now she understood that the deepest loneliness wasn't being alone, but sitting at a table with someone who looked at you every day, yet never truly saw you. Her phone vibrated. A message from Tomasz. "I hope you are satisfied." Eva gazed at the screen for a long moment. She didn't reply. Not out of a desire to punish him, but simply because she no longer felt the need to explain her newfound peace to someone who understood only his own loss. She tucked the phone into her purse and turned back to the room. Natalia was chatting with Irena. Adam was straightening a slightly crooked frame. People stood before her paintings, finding in them their own reflections. Departure, relief, fear, a new beginning. Eva took a deep breath. She wasn't too old, not too late, not an afterthought in someone else's life. She was a woman who for years had believed she had to wait to be chosen, until finally she chose herself. And that was when her life truly began. Ewa's story wasn't one of revenge, nor was it a tale that suddenly, after 50, everything becomes easy, beautiful, and redolent with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was the story of a woman who, for years, had been slowly disappearing, piece by piece, lost in her husband's jokes, in the silence at the dinner table, in the duties everyone took for granted, in the roles of wife, mother, organizer, the one who did everything. Then, one evening, one sentence, one public laugh. And Ewa understood that sometimes a person doesn't leave because they've stopped loving. Sometimes they leave because they've finally begun to love themselves. She didn't reclaim her life in a single day. It took pain, courage, silence, friendship, a conversation with her daughter, and the first painting where she could finally see herself. But she did the most important thing. She stopped waiting for others' approval, because a new beginning doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, with a suitcase by the door, a blank page, a signature on a document, the first breath that truly belongs to us. What do you think? Should Ewa have left sooner? Did that public joke finally reveal the truth about her marriage? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in her place. If this story touched you even a little, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, because in our next story, we'll show you how a single sentence at the family table can change an entire life. And remember, sometimes the greatest courage isn't proving something to someone else, but finally ceasing to prove your worth to people who never wanted to see it.